given that China has finally realised too that it has an ageing population, and so it's just done away with the single child policy. Finally, despite the fact that demographers have been telling them it won't work for 30 years. Anyway, thank you.
Look, I mean, there's a lot in that note, and I guess that I was at a meeting at UNESCAP actually, which I think Singapore also had a similar law, and there were discussions in other Asian countries saying, you know, this, you know, we look after, you know, we deal with it. We've got these things about. There was one case in which the cultural relativism argument went the other way, and we said that would run in Australian culture, and was probably inappropriate. But look, I think just going tangentially from your comments, I think one of the issues that's become clear is that, and picks up Ian's earlier point about the older persons issue just being about the interests of older persons, is that it's a broader social interest. I was quite struck by last UN meeting the Grey Panthers, who are this American retirees institution, to have one of the young interns make their statement, and as a formal representation, symbolic representation, the fact that older persons' issues are also everyone's issues. People have parents and grandparents who you know, support in different ways and are a resource, and so you know, obviously we have to be very careful it doesn't become a one group being played off against another. But and once again, that's why I think, you know, a discussion like this around a convention opens these issues up amongst a broader audience than previously might have been the case. But I do think, just like with disability and some of the other conventions, that we need to draw in a lot of material and think through some of these issues in a much broader notion than here is a right we need to confer. We need to sit very much in the social context and allow for states to have a certain amount of flexibility to respond to the particular conditions.
Hi, thanks, Andrew. Just a really quick comment, really. I'm struck by sort of how these processes about whether we need another treaty and all of that, to me, actually open up spaces for raising the level of debate and engaging the relevant communities which aren't necessarily thinking about these things. And as I think you rightly sort of say, you suddenly see vast amount of data, and we're calling on other experts to help us sort of build a proper impression of what's going on so that we can decide how to move forward. And I think that's a really, really important part of the process. And I think quite rightly, as David said as well, you know, we need to reflect on these issues, and I wonder whether it's still a useful engagement process, whether or not we get to the convention eventually or not. Do you think that perhaps the UN platform may not be the best place where this should happen, because as you said, they've got a cookie cutter approach and it's not always sort of conducive? But the other dimension I think that's also very, very important is to consider which stakeholder groups are being sort of engaged, and are they really the relevant people we should be speaking to? I like the nothing about us without us, but also sort of, you know, noting that the younger people actually are very much impacted by and implicated in what happens to older people around us. And where should we be sort of taking this conversation in order to have some fruitful outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, I take that as a comment. I think it's a comment, but the issue is, you know, who is the us, who is the community, and, you know, is there an inner circle and there an outer circle? Because it is a much, you know, broader issue. Is a UN process useful? Would it happen without a UN process? Possibly. I mean, it happened around non-treaty instruments with the Madrid National Plan of Action. I think what has been interesting with the Disability Convention is it has provided a fulcrum for advocacy at the national level, which governments who take these things reasonably seriously, and not every government does, you know, have really been challenged and have had to change things. Right? I mean, at the moment, for example, we're seeing challenges to electoral laws, which generally, probably in all our countries, exclude people with intellectual disabilities from voting. And yet that's the only group whose ability to understand anything about the political process is formally tested or assumed to be relevant by law. But the rights of persons with disabilities has recently said that Hungarian law, which does that, violates the convention. as a challenge before the German Constitutional Court on similar grounds. So, you know, these things that in different ways they help us to really change attitudes and policies and test what we're doing. So, you know, treaties are not perfect instruments. They're not the best instruments necessarily. They're not the only instruments or ways of doing it, but you know, they have provided a focal point, I think, and a wood era as well.
I think we're just about out of time, except I do have one, if you don't mind. Chair's prerogative to ask one more question. You mentioned the normative gap strategy that proponents of the treaty have been emphasizing, and I'm just curious, I mean, to what extent was that similar strategy employed by proponents of the CRPD? And do you see any difficulties with that strategy, especially if the convention is unsuccessful? Is this somehow going to, we were talking about this a bit yesterday, but somehow going to undermine the existing norms that in the ICCPR and the ICSCR that we mentioned?
I mean, I think the normative gap strategy, I mean, what's a normative gap? If there's a statement in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that everyone is entitled to equal protection of the law and non-discrimination, of course that covers age or older person. So, in a sense, there's no normative gap. If you say there is a failure to address things about institutional care, about financial abuse of elders, about the specificities, you know, is that a normative gap or is that something else? It seems to me that the normative gap, they come back and slap that away, and they said it's there, and sometimes it properly interpreted, it can do that. But what the issue is, in my view, is would addressing those specific issues and focusing attention on them be an overall benefit or an overall plus in addressing? That seems to me to be the critical question to ask, and I think disability has shown that probably is. And I think in these cases it might well be also. So that it would undermine it, I'm not sure. I think one of the big differences in the Disability Convention was there was a terrific report done by Gerard Quinn from Ireland and Theresia Degner from Germany for the Office of the High Commission, which went through the whole of the UN Human Rights Treaty system, looking at the practice of the treaty bodies, saying, yes, well, it's covered and they occasionally touch on it, but they haven't got the time or resources, they're dealing with everything, so there's no focus, there's no systematic, coherent approach to it, and therefore there is a need to have something else to supplement that. They didn't do that in the age context, and I think it may not have made a difference, but I think that report was very powerful, and it dealt with, it sidelined the normative gap issue. It said there's an implementation issue, and the current system doesn't do it and can't do it. You need more, and that was very effective.
Thank you. Now that I've monopolized the last bit of time with my question. Thank you all very much, and thank you very much, Andrew, for the excellent presentation and for responding to the comments and questions from the audience. And Andrew will be back in January to teach a course and also give at least one more talk, possibly more if we can convince him. But please join me in thanking him.